Welcome back to Night Shift Stories, where we share tales of the unknown, the eerie, and the unimaginable. Tonight's story takes us to the shadowy halls of an old hospital where strange things happen during the darkest hours. This is the Lost Ward. It was just another quiet night for Dr. Amelia Carter, a night shift surgeon at St. Augustine Hospital. For her, the night shift was routine, sewing up wounds, setting bones, running between emergency cases in the dead of night. She was used to the eerie stillness of the hospital halls, but nothing prepared her for what lay hidden in Ward E. Ward E. Just the sound of it made the older staff shudder. It was said to have been closed down years ago after a tragic fire in the 1980s that took the lives of patients and staff. Since then, it had sat empty and locked, a darkened wing that most people didn't even think about. But Dr. Carter wasn't one for ghost stories. She was a surgeon, a scientist, and every time she heard the faint sounds coming from behind the heavy double doors, she convinced herself it was just old pipes, settling walls, or perhaps even a trick of her own imagination. That is, until one night. It was around 2 a.m. when she first noticed it. Soft footsteps echoing down the hall. The footsteps seemed to come from Ward E. They were slow, patient, like someone was pacing. Curiosity got the best of her. Ignoring the warnings from Nurse Evelyn, the hospital's elderly head nurse, she decided to see what was going on. She pushed the door open, half expecting to see nothing but empty beds and dust-covered equipment, but instead she found life. The ward was active. Patients lay in beds murmuring softly, their IV drips steadily ticking away. Nurses bustled about, checking charts, administering medicine. And there in the dim light, doctors conferred in hushed voices. For a moment, she thought she'd wandered into a part of the hospital she didn't know existed. But then she noticed something strange. No one seemed to notice her. She watched the staff and patients in stunned silence. Their clothes, their hairstyles, even the medical equipment looked strangely outdated, like they were all stuck in the 1980s. And that's when the hairs on the back of her neck began to rise. Dr. Carter tried to shake it off. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, but the scene before her didn't change. One of the nurses turned and looked right at her. Her face was familiar, too familiar. It was Nurse Evelyn. But this Nurse Evelyn was younger, her uniform crisp, her hair styled in the way of the 80s. Dr. Carter blinked, and the older, real Nurse Evelyn's warning rang in her mind. Some things are best left undisturbed, Doctor. Let the dead rest. Suddenly a cold wave of realization washed over her. She backed away, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. As she reached for the door, another figure appeared, a man lying on a bed with burns covering his face and arms. His eyes met hers, filled with pain and recognition. She couldn't understand why, but something inside her told her to run. But it was too late. The patients, the staff, they all turned toward her. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, yet they stared with a pleading intensity that rooted her to the spot. She felt trapped, drawn into their world, as if invisible hands were pulling her deeper into their forgotten lives. Nurse Evelyn's words echoed once more, but this time they sounded different. The dead should stay with the dead, the living with the living. And then it hit her. Nurse Evelyn wasn't warning her to stay away for her own sake. Number Evelyn was trying to save her from joining them. The truth hit Amelia like ice. Ward E hadn't been part of her hospital for decades. She'd crossed over into something else, something beyond. Desperate to escape, she stumbled backward, clutching the door, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingers. And as she turned to flee, she caught one last terrible glimpse of Nurse Evelyn, who now stood ghostly pale, her eyes sad yet resigned. Evelyn mouthed one final message. You don't belong here. Not yet. Dr. Carter broke free, fleeing back into the lit hall, slamming the doors shut behind her. Her breaths came in gasps, and she stood there, trembling, clutching her chest as the lights flickered around her. The next morning, she found herself drawn to Ward E, but the doors were shut and locked, covered in dust, untouched, as if no one had been inside for years. No one spoke of it again, and she never dared return to those doors. But on quiet nights, when the hospital was still, she swore she could hear footsteps, faint voices, and the eerie echo of lives lost. And every now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of Nurse Evelyn, watching her from the shadows, as if reminding her to stay with the living. Thank you for listening to Night Shift Stories. We hope you enjoyed tonight's tale. Remember, some places are best left undisturbed, and sometimes it's better not to ask what lies beyond the closed doors of forgotten hospital wings. Sleep tight and stay with the living.